The first master who bought me admired my hands. They were beautiful hands, he said. Long fingers, smooth skin, perfectly suited for the delicate work of tending his prized garden. He had no idea that these same hands, which would cultivate his roses and trim his hedges, would also cultivate his death, one poisonous flower at a time. My name is Deline, and I have killed 7 men without ever touching their food, without ever entering their kitchens, without ever being suspected of murder. I killed them with beauty, with the flowers they admired, the gardens they strolled through, the ornamental plants they insisted I cultivate for their pleasure. I killed them so slowly, so subtly, that they died believing God had called them home, never understanding that a slave woman's hands had orchestrated their demise. The knowledge of how to kill with plants came from my grandmother, Adelaide, who was born into home and stolen across the ocean when she was 15 years old. She was a healer in her village, trained in the use of plants for medicine and for protection. She knew which leaves could cure a fever and which berries could stop a heart. She knew which flowers brought life and which brought death. Power comes in many forms, she told me when I was a child, as we worked together in the medicinal garden behind the slave quarters. The white man has the power of the whip, the chain, the law. But we have older power, power that comes from the earth itself, power they don't see because they think plants are just pretty things to look at. She taught me everything she knew before she died when I was 16, taught me which plants were safe and which were deadly, taught me how to recognize them by their leaves and flowers and roots, taught me how to prepare them, how to hide them, how to use them as weapons when the time came. Never use this knowledge carelessly, she warned. This is power that demands respect, that demands purpose. You kill only when you must, only when there is no other way to survive, only when justice demands it. I was 32 years old in 1843 when I killed my first master, and I had endured 16 years of slavery since my grandmother's death. I'd been sold 3 times, each time to a plantation that needed someone with knowledge of ornamental gardening, someone who could create the elaborate landscapes that wealthy Southerners used to display their taste and refinement. My first master after my grandmother died was a man named William Blackwood, a tobacco planter in Virginia who prided himself on having the most beautiful gardens in the county. He bought me specifically for my reputation as a skilled gardener, paying a premium price for someone with my expertise. At first, I was just grateful to be working with plants instead of in the fields, grateful to be using the knowledge my grandmother had given me. But gratitude died quickly when I realized that Master Blackwood expected more than gardening from me. He expected me to be available to him whenever he wanted, to submit to his desires without resistance, to be both his gardener and his concubine. I endured it for 3 years, letting him use my body while I planned and prepared and waited for the right moment. And then, music, in the spring of 1843, I began cultivating death in his beloved garden. The first plant I added was Oleander, Nerium oleander, music, with its beautiful pink and white flowers that looked innocent and lovely. I planted it near the bench where Master Black would like to sit in the evenings where he would smoke his pipe and admire his gardens. Oleander is deadly. Every part of it contains cardiac glycosides that can stop a heart. But the danger isn't just in eating it. The toxins can be absorbed through the skin, can be inhaled from smoke if the plant is burned. Music can accumulate in the body over time with repeated, low-level exposure. I planted oleander, and I made sure Master Blackwood spent time near it every day. I encouraged him to sit on that bench, to appreciate the beautiful flowers, music to help me trim the branches, always careful to position myself upwind so I wouldn't be affected, always making sure his hands touched the sap. His face was close to the blooms. The second plant was foxglove, digitalis perura, with its tall spikes of purple flowers that look like something from a fairy tale. Foxglove contains digitalin, another cardiac glycoside, another poison that affects the heart. I planted it along the path Master Blackwood walked every morning, close enough that he would brush music against it, that the tiny hairs on the leaves would release their toxins onto his skin. The third plant was lily of the valley, Convallaria males, with its delicate white bell-shaped flowers and sweet fragrance. Beautiful, innocent music, deadly. The entire plant contains convolutoxin, yet another cardiac glycoside. I planted it beneath his bedroom window where the scent would drift into his room at night, where he would inhale the fragrance for hours while he slept. I was patient. I was methodical. I gave him small doses every day, doses so tiny that they seemed harmless, that his body could process and eliminate, except that they were constant, unrelenting, music accumulating in his system day after day, week after week, month after month. After 6 months, Master Blackwood began to feel unwell. He complained of fatigue, music, of irregular heartbeat, of nausea and dizziness. The doctors examined him, prescribed various treatments, but found nothing seriously wrong. Just overwork, they said. Just stress, rest more, eat better, and you'll be fine. But he didn't get better. He got worse. His heart became more irregular. His energy continued to decline. His hands began to tremble. And I continued my work, continued tending the garden, continued ensuring he was exposed to my beautiful deadly plants every single day. 9 months after I started, William Blackwood died of what the doctors called heart failure. He was 53 years old, seemingly healthy until the mysterious illness that had slowly consumed him. No one suspected foul play. No one questioned whether his beautiful garden might have killed him. They buried him in the family cemetery and sold off his property, including me. I felt no guilt, no remorse, no regret. Master Blackwood had used me for 3 years, had raped me repeatedly, had treated me as property that existed solely for his pleasure. His death was justice, delivered slowly and invisibly by the plants he'd loved, music so much. My second master was a cotton planter in South Carolina named Edmund Hartwell. He bought me at auction in 1844, impressed by my reputation for creating beautiful gardens. He was kinder than Blackwood, less obviously cruel, but he was still a master, still someone who owned human beings, and believed that ownership gave him rights over every aspect of our existence. I began my work in his garden immediately, planting the same deadly trio, Oleander, foxglove, lily of the valley, along with some new additions. I added monkshood aconitum napellus with its beautiful blue-purple hooded flowers. Monkshood contains a quinine, a toxin that affects the nervous system and the heart. I added Angel's trumpet Bubmanisia species with large fragrant flowers that hang down like bells. Angel's trumpet contains tropane alkaloids that cause confusion, hallucinations, and eventually cardiac arrest. Master Hartwell died 18 months after buying me, his death attributed to a combination of heart problems and what the doctors called brain fever. He was 46 years old. My third master was a rice planter in Georgia named Thomas Peton. He lasted 14 months before the garden claimed him. His death recorded as kidney failure, though the real cause was the steady accumulation of toxins from the plants I'd so carefully cultivated around his home. My fourth master was a sugar planter in Louisiana named Robert Chevalier. He died after only 10 months, the shortest time yet, music. Because I'd refined my methods, had learned exactly which plants to use in which combinations, had perfected the art of invisible murder. By the time I killed my fifth master, a Charleston merchant named Samuel Winthrop, who'd purchased me to design the gardens of his new mansion, I had a reputation, not as a poisoner, never that, but as someone whose master seemed to die with unfortunate frequency, whose beautiful gardens seemed to bring bad luck to their owners. That Deline is cursed, other slaves whispered. Every master who buys her dies within 2 years. Beautiful gardens, beautiful flowers, but something about her brings death. The white folks, music, dismissed such talk as superstition, as the kind of foolish beliefs that slaves held because they didn't understand the natural world. They didn't believe in curses or bad luck, or the idea that a slave woman could have any power over her master's fate. That blindness, that arrogance, that absolute certainty that they were in control. That's what killed them. They never imagined that the delicate flowers I tended so carefully were weapons, that the beautiful gardens they displayed so proudly were death traps, that the slave woman with the green thumb and the lovely hands was actually an assassin executing them with exquisite patience. My sixth master was a tobacco merchant in North Carolina named Daniel Morrison. He bought me in 1848 despite warnings from friends that I might be unlucky because he was desperate to have gardens that would rival those of his neighbors and business associates. He was a vain man, obsessed with status and appearance, convinced that having the most beautiful gardens would elevate his social position. I gave him exactly what he wanted, gardens that were the envy of the county, with flowers that bloomed in spectacular profusion, with landscaping that drew visitors from miles around, and I gave him death, music, delivered one invisible dose at a time through the plants he loved so much. He lasted 13 months before his heart gave out, before the accumulated toxins finally overwhelmed his system, before he died in his beloved garden surrounded by the flowers that had killed him. My seventh master was a plantation owner in Virginia named Nathaniel Crawford. He bought me in 1849, fully aware of my reputation for being unlucky, but convinced that he was different, that his faith in God would protect him, that he was too strong and too blessed to fall victim to whatever curse seemed to follow me. He was wrong. I planted my deadly garden around his mansion with practiced precision, adding new varieties I'd learned about from other slaves and from careful observation. I added castor bean plants, Rhinus communis, which produce ricin, one of the most deadly toxins known. Music. I added yew trees, taxis species, which contain taxine alkaloids that cause cardiac arrest. I added autumn crocus, Colocucum autumn nail, which contains colchicine, a poison that causes organ failure. Music. And I waited. I tended the garden. I watched Nathaniel Crawford admire his beautiful flowers, and I counted the days until the toxins would accumulate to lethal levels. But this time, something was different. This time, someone was paying attention. Dr. Marcus Thornfield was a physician with an unusual interest in botany, a man who'd studied plants and their properties extensively. Music, who understood that the line between medicine and poison was often just a matter of dosage. He'd been called to attend Master Crawford during his final illness, and he'd noticed something that other doctors had missed. The symptoms were consistent with plant poisoning, specifically cardiac glycoside toxicity. He began asking questions, began investigating, began looking at patterns that no one else had noticed, and he discovered that I had been present at every death, that every master who died had beautiful gardens that I maintained, that the timing and symptoms were remarkably consistent across all 7 cases. Dr. Thornfield came to the garden one morning in the fall of 1849 while I was working among the flowers. He studied the plants carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. "These are poison gardens," he said finally, looking at me with a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. "Every one of these plants is toxic. Oleander, fox, music glove, lily of the valley, monkshood, angel's trumpet, castor bean, yew autumn crocus. This is an arsenal, not a garden. You've been killing them, haven't you? All 7 of them. You've been poisoning your masters with their own gardens." I met his eyes calmly, showing no fear, no guilt, no shame. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I just plant flowers, beautiful flowers that my masters request. If the flowers are dangerous, perhaps my masters shouldn't have asked for them." Music. "But you knew, Doctor," Thornfield insisted. "You knew exactly what these plants could, music, do. You cultivated them specifically for their toxic properties, positioned them where your masters would have maximum exposure, ensured they were slowly poisoned over months. This is murder, premeditated, music, calculated murder." "Is it murder to plant flowers?" I asked. "Is it murder if a man admires beauty, and that beauty happens to be deadly?" "These plants exist in nature, Dr. Thornfield. They grow wild in forests and fields. If God made them poisonous, is it my fault that men choose to cultivate them?" "You could hang for this," he said. "I could report you to the authorities, could testify about what I've discovered. You could be executed for what you've done." "Then do it," I said calmly. "Report me. Testify. Explain to everyone how a slave woman with no access to kitchens or food managed to poison 7 different men in 7 different locations using only flowers. Explain how I forced these men to sit near poisonous plants, to touch them, to inhale their fragrances. Explain how it's my fault they chose to cultivate deadly beauty." Dr. Thornfield was silent for a long moment, understanding the impossible position he was in. He could accuse me, could present his evidence, but proving intentional murder would be nearly impossible. I'd never touched their food, never been near them when they ingested anything, never done anything except plant flowers in gardens and care for them. Any prosecutor would struggle to prove criminal intent, would struggle to demonstrate that I deliberately, poisoned anyone rather than simply following orders to plant specific flowers. 7 men are dead because of you, he said finally. 7 men who owned other human beings are dead, I corrected. 7 men who raped and beat and worked to death people they considered property. 7 men who participated in a system of brutality, and exploitation. If my gardens happen to kill them, perhaps that's God's justice, not my crime. "You're dangerous," Dr. Thornfield said, "more dangerous than anyone realizes, and Master Crawford is dying just like the others. In a few days, he'll be dead, and you'll be sold to someone else, and the pattern will continue unless you—" "Stop it," I said, "unless you report me, have me arrested, bring me to trial. But then you'll have to explain how you know so much about plant poisons, how you were able to identify my methods. And people might start to wonder if you're not projecting, if you're not describing your own knowledge and methods rather than mine." It was a bluff, but it worked. Dr. Thornfield backed down, recognizing that accusing me would raise uncomfortable questions about his own expertise in toxicology. He left the garden that day without reporting me, without taking action, leaving me free to continue my work. But I knew my time was running out. He'd figured out what I was doing, which meant others might figure it out too. I needed to finish my mission and disappear before I could be stopped. Nathaniel Crawford died 3 days later. Music. His death recorded as heart failure like so many before him, and I began planning my escape, knowing that I would take with me the knowledge that had killed 7 masters, knowledge that could be shared with others, knowledge that could transform enslaved gardeners across the South into invisible assassins. The poison gardens were just the beginning. The real harvest was about to begin. After Master Crawford's death, I was placed on the auction block for the 8th time in my life. By then, I was 38 years, music old, and my reputation, though no one understood its true nature, preceded me. Potential buyers whispered about the unlucky gardener, whose masters died with suspicious frequency, and the bidding was notably cautious. I was eventually purchased by a merchant from Savannah named Henry Sutton, who either didn't believe in curses or thought he could beat the odds. He bought me for half of what I would have commanded without my reputation, taking me to his elaborate townhouse with its already established gardens. But I wasn't planning to stay long enough to kill him. During the weeks between Crawford's death and my purchase by Sutton, I'd made a decision. It was time to spread the knowledge my grandmother had given me, time to transform what I'd learned from a personal weapon into a collective one, time to teach other enslaved women how to turn gardens into graveyards. But first, I needed to document my methods to create a system that could be taught and replicated to transform instinct and inherited knowledge into something that could be shared. I began in Master Sutton's garden, not to kill him, not yet at least, but to perfect and codify my techniques. I divided the poisonous plants into categories based on their mechanisms and effects. The hearts, stoppers, oleander, foxglove, lily of the valley, plants containing cardiac glycosides that affected heart rhythm and could cause cardiac arrest. These were my primary weapons, reliable and difficult to detect because heart problems were common among wealthy men who lived sedentary lives and ate rich food. The nerve destroyers, monkshood, angel's trumpet, belladonna, hemlock, plants containing alkaloids that affected the nervous system, causing tremors, confusion, paralysis, and eventually death. These were useful for creating symptoms that look like strokes or brain fever. The organ killers, castor bean, autumn crocus, pokeweed, plants containing toxins that caused kidney or liver failure. These acted more slowly than the others, but were equally deadly and created symptoms that doctors attributed to natural organ deterioration. The combination killers, certain plants, worked synergistically, their effects multiplying when used together. Foxglove and lily of the valley, for example, both affected the heart, but through music, slightly different mechanisms, making the combined effect more powerful and harder to treat. The key to my method was understanding exposure pathways. Most people thought of poison as something ingested, something added to food or drink. But plants could deliver their toxins in multiple ways. Dermal contact. Many poisonous plants release their toxins through sap or tiny hairs on leaves and stems. When someone brushed against them, touched them while gardening, or got sap on their skin, the toxins were absorbed directly. Music. The absorption was slow. The doses were small, but with daily exposure over months, the effects were lethal. Inhalation. Some plants released their toxins into the air, especially when they were flowering or when their leaves were disturbed. Planting these near windows, benches, or walkways ensured constant low-level exposure. Angel's trumpet, for example, released tropane alkaloids that could be inhaled, causing gradual neurological damage. Environmental accumulation. Certain plants shed leaves, flowers, or seeds that decomposed and released toxins into the soil and water. If these plants were positioned near wells, water features, or areas where vegetables were grown, they could contaminate food sources indirectly, creating poisoning that seemed to have no source. My grandmother had taught me these pathways, but I'd refined them through years of practice, learning exactly which plants to use in which situations, how to maximize exposure while maintaining plausible deniability. The beauty of the method was its invisibility. I never touched my master's food. I never entered their private quarters uninvited. I never did anything except tend the gardens they asked me to create using plants they explicitly requested or approved. If those plants happened to be poisonous, if exposure to them happened to cause illness and death, how could that be my fault? I was just following orders, just doing my job, just creating beautiful landscapes. In Master Sutton's garden, I planted a memorial garden. That's what I called it, though. He thought I meant it as a tribute to his late wife. In reality, it was a living catalog of every poisonous plant I'd used, arranged in a way that maximized their aesthetic appeal. While documenting their properties, I created detailed drawings of each plant, noting their identifying features, their growth requirements, their toxic mechanisms, their ideal placement for maximum exposure. I wrote these notes in a mixture of French Creole and symbols that my grandmother had taught me. a code that looked like decorative embellishments on garden plants but actually contained deadly information. And I waited for my opportunity to escape and share this knowledge. The opportunity came in the spring of 1850 when a free black woman named Charlotte Lau came to Savannah as part of the Underground Railroad network. Music. She was posing as a seamstress traveling between plantations to do custom work for wealthy families. But her real purpose was to identify potential escapees and help them plan their journeys north. I met her when Master Sutton hired her to make new dresses for his daughters. We spoke briefly in the garden, our conversation appearing casual, but actually coded, establishing that we both understood what the other represented. Beautiful flowers. Charlotte, music, said, admiring the oleander blooming near the garden bench. My grandmother used to grow these in Louisiana. She said they were sacred, that they had power. All plants have power, I replied, my voice carefully neutral. Some give life, some take it away. The key is knowing which is which. Charlotte's eyes sharpened with understanding. I imagine a knowledgeable gardener to teach others about such power, could help them create their own gardens. If someone wanted to learn, I said carefully, they would need more than words. They would need seeds, cuttings, detailed instructions. They would need to understand not just what to plant, but where and how. Could such instructions be written down, Charlotte asked? Could they be carried and shared? They could, I said, if someone had time to document them properly and if someone had a way to transport both the documents and living plant material. That could be arranged, Charlotte said, but it would require the gardener to leave her current position to travel with me to help establish gardens elsewhere, to train others in the specialized knowledge. We were discussing my escape, though any observer would have thought we were simply chatting about flowers and gardening techniques. Charlotte was offering to help me reach the Underground Railroad to travel north while using my knowledge to help other enslaved people along the way. When? I asked simply. 2 weeks, Charlotte said. There's a network of safe houses between here and Virginia. At each one, there are women who work in gardens who could benefit from learning these techniques. We could travel from house to house, plantation to plantation, spreading the knowledge as we go. I agreed immediately. 2 weeks gave me time to prepare everything I would need. The seeds and cuttings for my poisonous plants, the documentation I'd been creating, the tools and supplies that would allow me to teach others. During those 2 weeks, I also completed one final task. I ensured that Master Sutton's garden would kill him. I couldn't leave him alive and healthy, couldn't waste the opportunity, couldn't let him continue to profit from slavery. So I accelerated my usual timeline, increased the toxin exposure, pushed him toward the same fate that had claimed my previous 7 masters. I planted additional oleander near his favorite reading spot. I added yew branches to the flower arrangements that his daughters placed throughout the house. I positioned Angel's trumpet beneath his bedroom window, ensuring he inhaled its neurotoxic fragrance every night, and I waited, watching music as the symptoms began. The irregular heartbeat, the confusion, the gradual weakening that doctors would attribute to age and natural decline. By the time I escaped with Charlotte, Henry Sutton was dying. Music, though he didn't know it yet. He would last another month, maybe 2, before the accumulated toxins finally stopped his heart. And when he died, the doctors would attribute it to heart failure, to the same mysterious ailment that seemed to afflict so many prosperous middle-aged men. No one would suspect that his beautiful garden had killed him. No one would understand that the slave woman who tended those flowers had sentenced him to death before she'd even met him, simply by being who she was and knowing what she knew. Charlotte and I left Savannah on a humid May night, traveling north with forged papers that identified me as a free woman named Deline, Charlotte's cousin. We moved slowly, stopping at plantations and farms where members of the Underground Railroad had identified enslaved women who worked with plants who might be willing to learn my methods, who might be able to use gardens as weapons. At each stop, I taught them. I showed them how to identify poisonous plants, how to cultivate them without arousing suspicion, how to position them for maximum exposure, how to be patient and methodical and invisible. I gave them seeds and cuttings from my deadly collection, along with drawings and instructions for their use. This is not revenge. I told them, this is justice, this is power, this is using the master's own love of beauty against him, but it requires patience, requires intelligence, requires the ability to wait months or years for results. Can you be patient? Some could. Some understood immediately what I was offering them, a way to fight back without raising a hand, a way to kill without being caught. Music, a way to strike at the heart of slavery itself by eliminating the masters who perpetuated it. Others were afraid. Music, unable to imagine taking such risks, unable to believe that a garden could be a weapon. I didn't push them, didn't try to convince them. This knowledge was dangerous, and it was only useful to people who were willing to use it. We traveled for 6 months, moving through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, each stop bringing new students, new gardens, new seeds of death planted in soil fertilized by slavery and watered with tears of the enslaved. And everywhere we went, I heard stories of masters dying mysteriously of sudden illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, of wealthy men struck down in their prime by heart problems and organ failures that seemed to come from nowhere. Some of those deaths were natural, of course, but some weren't. Some were the work of other women like me, women who'd learned from their grandmothers or mothers or aunts, women who discovered independently what I'd been taught, women who'd been using gardens as weapons long before I'd killed my first master. I wasn't unique. I was just part of a tradition, a lineage of plant knowledge that stretched back to Africa, that had survived the Middle Passage, that had been passed down through generations of enslaved women who understood that power came in many forms and that beauty could be music, deadly. My contribution was to systematize that knowledge, to document it, to turn scattered individual practices into a methodology that could be taught and replicated. I was transforming folk knowledge into a science, turning inherited wisdom into a manual for invisible resistance. By the time Charlotte and I reached Philadelphia in late 1850, I'd trained more than 30 women in the art of poison gardens. I distributed seeds and cuttings to dozens of plantations. I'd created a network of botanical assassins who would spend the next decade slowly, invisibly, patiently eliminating slave owners across the South. I'd started a plague, though no one would recognize it as such for years to come. A plague of mysterious deaths, of inexplicable illnesses, of masters dying in their beautiful gardens, surrounded by the flowers they loved, never understanding that those flowers were killing them, never suspecting that the slave women who tended those gardens were instruments of justice. The invisible method was spreading, and the harvest of death was just beginning. Philadelphia in 1850 was a city of contradictions, a place where slavery was illegal, but prejudice was rampant, where black people could be free but never quite equal, where the Underground Railroad operated in shadows, while slave catchers prowled the streets looking for fugitives to drag back south. I settled into a small room in a boarding house run by a free black woman named Esther Morrison, who provided safe haven for escaped slaves and asked no questions about their pasts. Charlotte had moved on to continue her work with the Underground Railroad, but she'd left me with contacts, resources, and a community of people committed to fighting slavery. For the first time in my life, I was free, really free. Not just legally, but practically able to make my own choices, to control my own time, to exist as a person rather than property. Music. It was disorienting, overwhelming, wonderful, and terrifying in equal measure, but I couldn't simply enjoy my freedom while others remained enslaved. I couldn't rest while the knowledge I possessed, knowledge that could strike at the heart of slavery, music, remained unused. So I continued my work, teaching and training anyone willing to learn, documenting my methods in greater detail, creating what would eventually become a comprehensive manual of botanical assassination. I called it the Garden of Justice. Though the title appeared nowhere on its pages, it was a book disguised as a botanical reference guide filled with beautiful illustrations of flowers and plants written in a mixture of English, French Creole, music, and the symbolic language my grandmother had taught me. To a casual observer, it looked like an ornamental gardening manual. To someone who knew how to read it, it was a deadly instruction manual. The book detailed hundreds of poisonous plants organized by their effects, their geographic distribution, their cultivation requirements, and their methods of toxin delivery. Music. It included specific instructions for using them as weapons, how to position them for maximum exposure, how to combine them for synergistic effects, how to time the poisoning to avoid detection, how to maintain plausible deniability, but more importantly, it included detailed information about the slow accumulation method, the technique that had allowed me to kill 7 masters without ever being suspected, the methodology that was now being used by women across the South to eliminate 8 their oppressors. The key to slow accumulation was understanding toxicocynetics, the science of how the body processes toxins. Most poisons, if given in small enough doses, can be metabolized and eliminated by the liver and kidneys. The body has remarkable detoxification systems that can handle low levels of many substances, but those systems have limits. If toxins are administered constantly faster than the body can eliminate them, they begin to accumulate in tissues in the liver, the kidneys, the heart, the brain, the fat stores. The accumulation is gradual, invisible, causing no obvious symptoms at first. But eventually, the accumulated toxins reach a threshold where they begin to cause damage, and that damage compounds cascades, becomes irreversible. The beauty of music, this method, is that the poisoning appears natural. A doctor examining someone dying from accumulated cardiac glycosides sees heart failure, which is accurate, just not complete. They see irregular heartbeat, weakened heart muscle, fluid accumulation, all consistent with natural heart disease. They don't see poison because they're not looking for it, because the symptoms develop so gradually that they seem like natural decline. And even if they suspected poisoning, testing for it is difficult when music, the doses are so small and so constant. The toxins are present in the body, yes, but at levels that might be attributed to environmental exposure, music, to consuming plants accidentally, to any number of innocent explanations. This was the method I documented in my book, along with specific protocols for different situations. The short protocol, 6 to 12 months, for situations where speed was more important than absolute security, used higher doses and more potent plant combinations. Riskier but faster. The long music protocol, 12-24 months. The method I'd used most often balanced speed with security, killed reliably while maintaining plausible deniability. The extended protocol, 2 to 5 years, for situations where maximum security was essential. Extremely slow music, extremely safe, virtually undetectable. The victim died so gradually that even family members didn't realize something was wrong until the final stages. Music, each protocol included specific plant recommendations, positioning strategies, exposure maximization techniques, and warning signs that might indicate the poisoning had been detected. I also included a section on risk management: how to avoid suspicion, how to respond if questioned, how to ensure that even if one poisoner was caught, the network wouldn't be compromised. The key was independence. Each woman worked alone, knew only her immediate contacts, could never expose the broader network, even if tortured or coerced. As I worked on this documentation, I began hearing reports from the South, reports that confirmed my methods were spreading, music, that the network I'd helped establish was functioning, that masters were dying with increasing frequency from mysterious illnesses. A plantation owner in Georgia died of heart failure at 45. His beautiful gardens tended by a slave woman who'd learned from a visitor passing through 6 months earlier. A tobacco merchant in Virginia died of kidney failure at 52. His ornamental gardens, designed by a slave who'd received seeds and instructions from a free black woman traveling through the area. A rice planter in South Carolina died of what doctors called apoplexy at 49. His elaborate gardens, maintained by a slave who'd been taught the slow accumulation method by another enslaved woman. The pattern was impossible to see unless you knew what to look for, unless you understood that these deaths were connected, that they were part of a coordinated campaign of botanical assassination being waged by enslaved women across the South. And the white folks didn't see it. They saw individual tragedies, unfortunate natural deaths, the kind of illnesses that afflicted prosperous middle-aged men who lived sedentary lives. They never imagined that the flowers their slaves tended with such care were weapons, that the gardens they displayed so proudly were death traps, that a coordinated resistance movement was killing them slowly from within. In 1852, I received a visitor, a young enslaved woman named Sarah, who'd escaped from a plantation in Alabama and made her way north with help from the Underground Railroad. She'd been sent to me specifically because she had questions about botanical methods, because she wanted to learn not just for herself, but to music, take the knowledge back south. I'm planning to go back, she told me, her voice firm despite the obvious danger of what she was proposing. I'm going to pretend I was recaptured, going to return to the plantation and continue the work. But I need to know I'm doing it right. Need to understand the methods completely. Going back is suicide, I warned her. If they catch you, if they realize you escaped and returned, they'll kill you. They're killing us anyway, Sarah said simply. Just slowly, with work and violence and despair. At least this way I'm fighting back. At least this way I might save some lives by taking others. I couldn't argue with that logic, so I taught her everything I knew. Spent 3 weeks training her in plant identification, cultivation, positioning, music, and the slow accumulation method. I gave her seeds carefully hidden in the lining of her clothes, gave her a copy of my documentation disguised as a Bible, gave her the knowledge that might kill her or might allow her to kill dozens of masters over the course of her life. Be patient, I told her before she left. Be methodical. Be invisible. The moment you become visible, the moment anyone suspects what you're doing, you're dead. Success requires absolute patience and perfect execution. I understand, Sarah said. And Deline, music. Thank you for the knowledge, for the training, for showing us that we have power even when we seem powerless. You've given us a weapon that no one can take away. Music. Knowledge that can be passed down through generations. That's worth more than freedom. That's worth everything. She left Philadelphia in the spring of 1853, disappearing back into the South, back into slavery, back into danger. I never learned what happened to her, never knew if she succeeded or was caught, never discovered how many masters she might have killed. But I thought about her often, wondered if she was out there planting death in beautiful gardens, wondered if some of the mysterious deaths I heard about were her work. The reports continued to come in, carried by escaped slaves, by free black travelers, by abolitionists who moved between North and South. Masters were dying at an alarming rate, not enough to be obvious, not enough to trigger investigations, but enough to be noticeable if anyone was paying music attention. And in 1853, someone finally did pay attention. Dr. Tendidus, Marcus Thornfield, the same physician who discovered my methods back in Virginia, published a paper in a medical journal titled An Epidemiological Study of Unexplained Deaths Among Plantation Owners, a Possible Botanical Connection. In the paper, he documented what music discovered, an unusual pattern of deaths among slave owners, particularly those who maintained elaborate ornamental gardens. He noted the consistency of symptoms, primarily cardiac and renal failures, and the presence of known poisonous ornamental plants in many of the gardens where the victims had spent significant time. I propose, he wrote, that we are witnessing not a series of unrelated natural deaths, but rather a coordinated campaign of botanical poisoning perpetrated by individuals with extensive knowledge of toxic plants. The consistency of the pattern, the prevalence of ornamental poisonous plants in the gardens of the deceased, and the statistical improbability of so many similar deaths in similar circumstances all point to intentional poisoning. The paper caused a minor sensation in medical circles, but it was largely dismissed by the general public and by slave owners themselves. The idea that slaves, illiterate, ignorant slaves as they thought of us, could orchestrate such a sophisticated campaign of poisoning was simply too absurd to take seriously. Thornfield's lost his mind, one plantation owner wrote in response. He's seeing conspiracies where there are only coincidences. Our slaves don't have the intelligence or the knowledge to execute such a plan. They're simple people, incapable of this kind of complex thinking. That arrogance, that absolute certainty in our inferiority, was exactly what made the method so effective. They couldn't imagine that we were capable of what we were doing. So, they didn't see it even when evidence was presented directly to them. But Dr. Thornfield's paper did have one effect. It made some plantation owners more cautious about their gardens, more suspicious of the slaves who tended them. A few even went so far as to have their gardens redesigned, removing plants that Thornfield had identified as potentially dangerous. Those precautions saved some lives, I'm sure, but they also came too late for many, and they failed to address the broader network we'd established, because by 1853, the knowledge had spread too far to be contained, had been taught to too many women, had taken root in too many gardens across the South. The slow accumulation was continuing. The harvest of death was ongoing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it without fundamentally changing the system that had created it. You can't maintain slavery while simultaneously trusting slaves with your gardens, your food, your children, your lives. You can't brutalize people and expect them not to fight back. You can't create a system of absolute power over human beings and be surprised when those human beings find ways to strike back at the powerful. We were fighting back, one poisoned garden at a time, one accumulated toxin at a time, one dead master at a time, and we would continue fighting until slavery itself was dead, until the gardens of the South bloomed with freedom instead of death. The slow accumulation had become a revolution, invisible, patient, deadly, and unstoppable. Dr. Marcus Thornfield's 1853 paper on unexplained plantation owner deaths might have been dismissed by most of society, but it caught the attention of someone who took it very seriously. Dr. Summers, Harold Pettin, a botanist and toxicologist from the University of Virginia who specialized in poisonous plants native to North America. Dr. Stead, Peyton read Thornfield's paper with growing fascination, recognizing patterns that others had missed. As someone who'd spent 20 years studying plant toxins, he understood exactly what the symptoms described in the paper indicated. Not natural illness, but systematic poisoning using cardiac glycosides, alkaloids, and other plant-based toxins. In the fall of 1853, Dr. Peyton undertook what he called a botanical survey of plantations where masters had died under circumstances matching Thornfield's description. He traveled through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, visiting estates, examining gardens, documenting plant species, music, and interviewing survivors and doctors. What he discovered shocked him. At every single plantation where a master had died mysteriously, the gardens contained an unusual concentration of poisonous, music, ornamental plants: oleander, foxglove, lily of the valley, monkshood, angel's trumpet, yew, castor bean, autumn crocus. Plants that were beautiful but deadly, plants that most people admired without understanding their danger. More significantly, he discovered that many of these gardens had been designed or maintained by enslaved women who worked exclusively with ornamental plants, who had reputations for creating beautiful landscapes, who had extensive knowledge of bot that seemed unusual for people who supposedly had no formal education. Dr. Petchin began connecting dots that no one else had noticed. He discovered that several of these women had worked at multiple plantations where masters had died. He learned that some of them had traveled extensively, unusual for slaves, visiting other plantations to consult on garden design. He found that they communicated with each other, sharing seeds and coatings and advice about cultivation. And he realized with growing certainty that he was looking at a network, an organized resistance movement using botanical knowledge as a weapon against slavery. In January of 1854, Dr. Peton published his findings in a detailed monograph titled Poisoned Gardens, a study of botanical assassination among the enslaved population. The monograph was comprehensive, scientific, and damning. Music. It laid out exactly how enslaved women were using poisonous plants to kill their masters, documented the specific plants and methods being used, and called for immediate action to prevent what he called a silent epidemic of botanical murder. Unlike Thornfield's paper, which had been theoretical and easily dismissed, Pemberton's monograph was concrete and impossible to ignore. It included drawings of specific plants, maps showing the geographic distribution of suspicious deaths, case studies of individual poisonings, and testimony from doctors who treated the victims. The monograph caused a panic among slave owners. Suddenly, the beautiful gardens they'd taken such pride in seemed threatening. The slave women who tended those gardens became suspect. Ornamental plants that had been admired for their beauty were now viewed with suspicion and fear. Plantation owners began destroying their gardens, ripping out plants that Petchin had identified as poisonous. They fired or sold enslaved women who worked with plants, replacing them with men or with women who had no botanical knowledge. They brought in white gardeners to redesign their landscapes to using only plants that Pettin had certified as safe, and they began investigating, looking for evidence of the network that Petchin had described, trying to identify the women who were part of it, trying to understand how widespread the poisoning campaign had become. This created a crisis for our network. Many of the women I trained were suddenly under suspicion, their movements restricted, their access to gardens limited or eliminated entirely. Some were questioned, threatened, even tortured in attempts to extract confessions or information about other members of the network. News of Pettin's investigation reached me in Philadelphia through the Underground Railroad communication network. Charlotte brought me a copy of the monograph, her face, music, grave. "They know," she said simply. "Not everything, but enough. They know about the poison gardens. They know enslaved women are behind it. And they're looking for the source. They're looking for whoever started this, whoever trained the others. They're looking music for you, Deline." I read the monograph carefully, analyzing what Petchin had discovered and, more importantly, what he hadn't. He'd identified the methods, the plants, the general pattern, but he hadn't identified me specifically, hadn't traced the network back to its origins, hadn't discovered the documentation I'd created, or the training system I'd established. "He's smart," I said, setting down the monograph. "Smarter than I expected, but he's also working from incomplete information. He knows what we're doing, but not how we're doing it. Music. He knows there's a network, but not how it's organized. And he doesn't understand that this knowledge isn't new, isn't something I invented. It's old, passed down through generations, part of our heritage from Africa." "That won't matter if he catches you," Charlotte warned. "If they connect you to even one of those deaths, they'll execute you publicly, brutally, as a warning to others. You need to be more careful. Need to limit your activities. Need to—" "No," I interrupted. "I need to do the opposite. Petchin's investigation will disrupt our network temporarily, but music, it won't destroy it. The knowledge is already out there, already being used, already embedded in communities across the South. What I need to do now is ensure that knowledge survives, that it can be passed down even if I'm caught, even if the current network is dismantled." Over the next few months, I worked on creating multiple copies of the Garden of Justice, hiding them with different members of the Underground Railroad network, ensuring that even if some copies were discovered and destroyed, others would survive. I also began training teachers, music, women who could pass on the knowledge even if they never used it themselves, who could ensure the tradition continued through generations. But I also knew I needed to respond directly to Peaton's investigation, needed to demonstrate that his discoveries hadn't stopped us, that the botanical assassination campaign would continue despite increased scrutiny. I decided to target Dr. Peton himself. It was risky, targeting someone who'd explicitly studied our methods, who understood plant poisons better than most, who would be on guard against exactly the kind of attack I was planning. But it was also necessary both practically and symbolically. Practically, because eliminating him would slow the investigation. Symbolically, because it would demonstrate that even those who thought they understood our methods, who believed they could defend against us, were still vulnerable. I traveled to Charlottesville in the spring of 1854, using forged papers identifying me as Deline Lauren, a free woman of color from New Orleans visiting relatives. I established myself in the free black community, found work as heiress, and began gathering information about Dr. Peaton's habits and routines. He lived in a modest house near the university, surrounded by, ironically, a garden. His garden was different from those I usually worked with. It was a research garden containing specimens he was studying, including many of the poisonous plants he documented in his monograph. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who'd exposed our methods surrounded himself with the very weapons we used, believing his knowledge made him safe, that understanding the plants would protect him from their effects. Music was wrong. I couldn't access his garden directly. He had students and assistants who worked there, and an unknown woman approaching would attract attention, but I didn't need direct access. I needed only to know what plants he had, how he interacted with them, and how to maximize his exposure without being detected. I observed his routine for 3 weeks, learning that he spent several hours every day in his research garden, that he often worked without gloves, that he had a habit of bringing cut flowers and plant specimens into his house for closer study. And then I acted. I identified a student who worked in Peton's garden, a young man who was struggling financially and willing to accept small payments for running errands. Through intermediaries, I arranged for him to deliver a gift to Dr. Peton, a bouquet of flowers from an admirer who appreciated his important work. The bouquet was beautiful, carefully arranged, containing flowers that were perfectly safe when viewed, but deadly when handled repeatedly. Monkshood, oleander, foxglove, all arranged with their stems freshly cut. Music, releasing sap that contained high concentrations of toxins. Dr. Peton accepted the bouquet graciously, placed it in a vase in his study, and returned to his work. Over the next few days, he handled the flowers repeatedly, rearranging them, examining them with his botanist's eye. Music, even dissecting some of the blooms to study their structures. Each time he touched them, he absorbed a small dose of mixed toxins. Not enough to cause immediate symptoms, not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to begin accumulating in his system. I sent more bouquets over the following weeks, each one seemingly from a different admirer. Music, each one carefully designed to deliver measured doses of plant toxins. I varied the plants, the arrangements, music, the delivery methods, ensuring that no pattern would be obvious, that the poisoning would seem like natural illness rather than intentional attack. 6 weeks after I'd sent the first bouquet, Dr. Peton began experiencing symptoms: irregular heartbeat, nausea, confusion, visual disturbances. He recognized the symptoms immediately, understood he was being poisoned, and sought treatment. But understanding the problem didn't help him solve it. The toxins had been accumulating for weeks, were stored in his tissues, were causing damage faster than his body could repair. His heart was failing, his kidneys were shutting down, his nervous system was compromised. He died in July of 1854, 2 months after the first bouquet, surrounded by the poisonous plants he'd spent his career studying. The doctors treating him knew he'd been poisoned. His own diagnosis had told him that, but they couldn't identify the source, couldn't determine how the poison had been delivered, couldn't trace it back to the mysterious bouquets from admirers, and no one connected it to me. I was just a Laris, an unremarkable free black woman living quietly in the community, someone who'd never met Dr. Peton, who had no apparent connection to his work or his death. Dr. Sitchin's. Peton's death had exactly the effect I'd intended. It terrified those investigating the botanical poisoning network. If someone as knowledgeable as Peton could be killed, music, despite understanding the methods, despite being on guard, despite actively studying the threat, then no one was safe. The investigators became hesitant, reluctant to pursue their inquiries too aggressively, afraid that too much attention would make them targets. The investigation didn't stop entirely, but it slowed dramatically. And in that breathing space, our network reconstituted itself, adapted to the increased scrutiny. found new ways to operate and new methods for avoiding detection. The botanical assassination campaign continued, and I returned to Philadelphia satisfied that I'd sent a clear message. We would not be stopped. We would not be intimidated, and those who tried to expose us would face the same fate as those who'd enslaved us. The poison gardens would bloom until slavery itself was dead. Dr. Sturm, Piton's death in 1854 should have ended the investigation into botanical poisonings, but instead it created a different kind of attention. The authorities in Virginia, convinced that his death proved music, the existence of an organized poisoning network, intensified their efforts to identify and capture those responsible. They focused particularly on free black women with botanical knowledge, on women who traveled between plantations, on anyone who might have had contact with multiple victims. And inevitably, despite my precautions, my name began appearing in their investigations. Someone had talked, whether through coercion, torture, or genuine betrayal. I never learned. Music. But in the fall of 1854, agents from Virginia arrived in Philadelphia with warrants for my arrest, claiming I was a fugitive slave and a suspected poisoner, wanted for questioning in multiple deaths. Charlotte brought me the warning, barely in time. "They're coming for you tonight," she said breathlessly. "You need to leave now this minute. They have your address, they have your description, and they have authorization to use whatever force necessary to bring you back to Virginia." I prepared for this possibility, had always known that my past might catch up with me. I had a bag packed with essentials, music, had money hidden in multiple locations, had contacts who could help me disappear. But I also had something more valuable: seeds. I'd spent the past 4 years collecting and preserving seeds from every poisonous plant I'd ever worked with, carefully storing them in sealed packets, labeled with their species names and growth requirements. These seeds represented the culmination of my knowledge, the physical embodiment of the botanical assassination methods I developed and refined over years of practice. I couldn't leave them behind, couldn't let them be discovered and destroyed. So I packed them carefully in the lining of my clothes and the false bottom of my bag, in every concealed space I could find. Hundreds of seed packets representing dozens of species carrying the potential for thousands of poison gardens that could be planted across the South. "Where will you go?" Charlotte asked as I finished my preparations. "West," I said. "Not north to Canada like they'll expect. West, through the territories where slavery is still being debated, where the law is unclear, where I can move without being traced." "That's incredibly dangerous," Charlotte warned. "The territories are violent, lawless. A black woman traveling alone. "We'll be safer than a black woman in custody in Virginia," I interrupted. "If they catch me, they'll execute me publicly. They'll make an example of me. We'll ensure everyone knows what happens to slaves who fight back. I won't give them that satisfaction. I won't let my death be used to terrorize others into submission." I left Philadelphia that night, carrying my seeds, my documentation, and my determination to ensure the knowledge would survive even if I didn't. I traveled west through Pennsylvania into Ohio, then into Indiana and Illinois, always moving, never staying anywhere long enough to be traced. And everywhere I went, I found women working with plants. I found enslaved women on farms and plantations, even in the supposedly free territories where slavery officially didn't exist but was practiced anyway under different names. I found free black women struggling to survive in hostile environments, farming small plots of land, tending gardens for wealthy white families, and I taught them. I distributed my seeds, shared my documentation, trained them in the methods I'd developed. I planted the knowledge like seeds themselves, ensuring it would take root and grow, ensuring the botanical assassination network would spread beyond the South, beyond the reach of any investigation, beyond any possibility of being completely eliminated. In some communities, I stayed long enough to see the gardens planted to ensure the methods were understood. In others, I left only seeds and instructions, trusting that the knowledge would be used wisely, that the women I'd trained would exercise the patience and discretion necessary for success. The journey west became a mission, a purpose that sustained me through exhaustion, danger, and the constant fear of being caught. I was no longer just escaping. I was planting a different kind of crop, a harvest of justice that would ripen slowly over decades, that would claim lives long after I was gone. In 1856, I reached Kansas Territory, where the conflict over slavery had erupted into open warfare between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The violence, the chaos, the breakdown of law and order, all of it created opportunities for someone like me, someone who knew how to kill quietly while everyone else was killing loudly. I settled briefly in Lawrence, a free soil town that had been attacked by pro-slavery music raiders the previous year. I found work with a family of abolitionists, tending their garden, teaching their daughters about plants. And I taught other things to other people. Enslaved women who'd been brought to Kansas by pro-slavery settlers, free black women who'd come hoping to claim land and freedom, white abolitionist women who were willing to use any weapon in the fight against slavery. I gave them seeds. I gave them knowledge. I gave them power. And I heard stories of pro-slavery settlers, music, dying mysteriously. I have slave owners in border states succumbing to inexplicable illnesses, of beautiful gardens that seemed to bring death to those who owned them. The Botanical assassination network had spread beyond anything I'd imagined, had taken on a life of its own, had become a genuine movement rather than just the isolated actions of individual women. We were fighting back using the tools available to us, refusing to accept our oppression passively. But in 1857, my journey west came to an end. Music. I was betrayed again, and I never learned by whom. And agents tracking me finally caught up. They arrested me in a small town in western Kansas, intending to transport me back to Virginia to stand trial for Dr. Dennis Peyton's murder and the deaths of my 7 former masters. I knew I wouldn't survive the trial. I knew they would execute me publicly and brutally. Music, as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of resistance. So, I made a final decision, a final act of defiance. The night before I was to be transported, I poisoned myself. I used seeds from my own collection, monkshood carefully prepared, taken in a dose that would be fast but not immediate. That would give me time to destroy any remaining documentation before the effects became irreversible. I burned my journals, my detailed records, anything that could be used to identify the women I'd trained or trace the network I'd helped create. I left only the seeds carefully hidden where they would be found by the right people, where they would continue spreading long after I was gone. And then I waited for the poison to take effect, felt my heart begin to race and then slow, felt the numbness spreading through my body, felt the world beginning to fade. My last thought was of my grandmother Adelaide, who taught me everything I knew, who'd given me the knowledge that had become my weapon and my legacy. I hoped she would be proud of what I'd done with her gift, how I'd transformed her healing knowledge into a tool of justice, how I'd used beauty to deliver death to those who deserved it. They found me dead the next morning, swamped in my cell with no obvious cause of death. The doctors who examined me were baffled. I appeared to have died of heart failure, but I was only 46 years old and had seemed healthy the day before. They never understood that I poisoned myself with the same plants I'd used on others, that I'd chosen my own death rather than give them the satisfaction of executing me, that even in death, I was demonstrating the power of botanical knowledge. But my story didn't end with my death. The seeds I'd hidden were found by members of the Underground Railroad network and distributed across the South and West. The women I trained continued their work, training others in turn, creating a lineage of knowledge that would persist for decades. In the 1850s and 1860s, there was an unexplained epidemic of deaths among slave owners. Heart failures, kidney failures, neurological disorders that struck down men in their prime. Doctors were baffled, unable to explain why so many wealthy, seemingly healthy men were dying suddenly. Some attribute it to the stress of the approaching Civil War. Others blame changes in diet or environment, or any number of natural factors. No one saw the pattern. No one connected the deaths to the beautiful gardens that surrounded the victims' homes. No one understood that a silent war was being waged, using flowers as weapons. The Botanical assassination network continued operating through the Civil War and into Reconstruction, gradually fading as slavery ended, and the women who carried the knowledge died or stopped teaching it. But echoes of it persisted in folk traditions, in stories of plants that could bring death, in warnings about handling certain flowers, in the careful respect that some communities maintain for botanical knowledge. Delphi's legacy wasn't just the men she killed or the network she created. It was the demonstration that power came in many forms, that resistance didn't always look like violence, that beauty could be deadly. And that knowledge, especially knowledge of the natural world, was a weapon that no master could confiscate, no law could forbid, no chain could restrain. She died in 1857, never living to see slavery abolished, never knowing that her methods would inspire generations of people to recognize that even the most oppressed had power, that even slaves could fight back, that justice could be achieved through patience, intelligence, and the strategic use of knowledge. The 7 masters she killed directly were just the beginning. The women she trained killed dozens more, and the knowledge she preserved and distributed to hundreds of deaths over decades. An invisible plague of botanical justice that struck at the heart of slavery itself. This was the story of Deline, enslaved gardener and botanical assassin who killed 7 masters without ever touching their food and trained dozens of other women to do the same. She died in custody in Kansas Territory in 1857 at the age of 46 of apparent heart failure that was actually self-administered poison. Her seeds and her knowledge spread through the Underground Railroad network and beyond, creating what historians later called the unexplained mortality spike among slave owners in the 1850s and 1860s. No comprehensive count of victims exists, but estimates suggest that botanical poisoning methods taught by Deline and her students may have resulted in hundreds of deaths. Her documentation, fragments of which survived in various archives, became the basis for later studies of plant toxicology and ethnobotanical knowledge among enslaved populations. She was never publicly identified as the source of the poisoning network, and her role remained hidden until historians piecing together fragmentary evidence in the 20th century began to understand the scope of what she'd accomplished. She is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Kansas, but her legacy lives in the folk knowledge of poisonous plants that persists in some communities, in the caution with which certain flowers are still handled, in the stories of women who fought back using the knowledge that white society dismissed as mere superstition. Deline proved that the enslaved were never as powerless as their masters believed, that resistance took many forms, and that sometimes the deadliest weapons were the most beautiful ones. The echoes of Deline's poisonous gardens reverberate through time, a chilling reminder that resistance flourishes in unexpected forms, that beauty can mask death, and that knowledge is the most powerful weapon of all. Her story reveals a hidden dimension of slavery resistance that historians are only beginning to understand. The botanical assassins who used their master's love of ornamental gardens to deliver justice, one toxic flower at a time. She transformed inherited African plant knowledge into a systematic methodology, trained dozens of women across the South, and created a network of invisible resistance that claimed hundreds of lives while never firing a shot or raising a hand in obvious violence. The slow accumulation of plant toxins, music, so gradual, so subtle, so perfectly mimicking natural illness, represents the ultimate strategic patience, the long game played by those with no other options. If these untold stories of botanical brilliance and invisible warfare resonate with you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of slavery, stories of those who fought back with intelligence instead of violence, who turned their oppressors' complacency into vulnerability, who proved that knowledge could be more deadly than any weapon. Your support ensures these powerful narratives of scientific resistance continue to educate and inspire. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Does Delphi's method represent justified resistance or go too far? How does botanical assassination compare to other forms of resistance? Let us know which untold tale you'd like to hear.